And you already have that chat up.
Yeah, you saw what I
Yes.
put for you.
Yes. Okay.
Is she the only one?
No, well, yeah, not everybody has their faces up, but that's fine. I'm okay with that. Good morning. I'm gonna, if,
grab your form.
okay, perfect. One of the things I will tell you guys that we'll start out with before we even get into the contract is, if you all have not done this, when you get ready to start your contract, the first part of the contract starts out with the buyer and the seller's names. So if you are the buyer's agent, obviously you are going to go and get your buyer's names by asking them who they are. Now, what's funny is every so often you'll have people that will refer to themselves as husband and wife, but they will not actually be married. This has happened to me a couple of times. So be aware that you need to actually ask them if they are legally married. And this is one of those things that it's kind of like that funny thing, but I always say, this has actually happened to me. So you can say, I was in a class one day and my teacher told me that she has had this happen several times where people have referred to themselves as my spouse or my husband or my wife, and then come to find out they were not legally married. And in the state of Florida, it does matter if you are legally married, because it is automatically part of the title if you are legally married. So your husband or wife has to go on title if you're legally married. So you need to ask that question. Now, also, if they are not divorced legally, the husband or wife would also have to be on the title. So understand that if they are buying and they have not finalized their divorce, husband or wife would have to also sign. So that's an important question when you are dealing with anybody, really. And nowadays it can be wife and husband, right? So it just, whatever it is, spouse.
What if the spouse will not sign?
Then honestly, they can't. They cannot. They cannot purchase. They cannot sell.
What's the key to the internet key?
It is right behind you. It's #1G Gainesville. So that is a problem. It has happened, and it is unfortunate, but yeah, in the state of Florida, it's community property, and if it is primary residence, they cannot sell it if the spouse will not sign. So unfortunately, that is a bad deal. So on the selling side, on the listing side, when you are going in to write the contract. So let's say you're the buyer's agent and you need to know who to make this contract out to as the seller. Do not trust the listing agent. Even if they're a Keller Williams agent. I love to say we all know what we're doing, but sometimes we don't. Because we have to trust our sellers telling us the right information, and sometimes our sellers aren't right either. But you do your best information by looking up the deed. Okay. The deed is your best guess information. Sometimes the deed still can be incorrect. So I do two things when I get ready to write a contract. First, I'm going to text or call the listing agent, and I'm going to ask, hey, how is this contract to be made out? Is anything changed from the current deed? Meaning, did they get married? Did they get divorced? Did somebody die? Right? Those are the three main things that may have changed from a deed. And then I'm going to look up the deed because I want to see how it was titled the previous time it was purchased. Now, in looking at a deed, the best way, if it's in Alachua County, it's super easy, because in Alachua County, you can go to, and I'm going to put this in the chat for everybody here. Let's see if I can get in here. I'm used to an Apple, so you guys are going to have to bear with me. So www.acpafl.org, which is the Alachua County Property Appraiser Florida site. When you go on that site, it's pretty easy. It's going to have a section at the top that says property search. You're going to click on there, and then it's going to give you some options. It's going to either say address search, owner name, parcel number. So whatever you've got from your link in Paragon, if you're in Paragon, you can actually click the little check mark. If it's in Alachua County, it'll take you right to this. When you go on there, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see that there's highlighted sale dates. Those highlighted sale dates are actually links, and that link will actually take you to that deed. So if you go to that deed, you pull it up, it'll actually read the names of the people that have actually purchased it. Sometimes it's in a trust, sometimes it's in people's actual names, sometimes it's in a business name. So those are all important things to be looking at when you're writing that contract, because you do want to write the contract according to the way it's written in that deed. And again, has anyone died? Has anyone gotten married? Has anyone gotten divorced? So those are probably the main highlights of that first couple of sentences. Now let's talk about really quickly as is versus residential, and then we'll get into the actual contract. There are two types of contracts. The residential is the residential purchase and sale agreement. That's the normal PASA. That contract is basically going to be used if you are walking up to a house and you walk around and you think, gosh, there's a few things wrong with this house, and I know my buyer is going to need to have some of these things fixed, and I can pretty much gauge that there's, a few $1,000s here and there. I think this seller would probably give us those few $1,000s in fixes, and so I'm going to use this residential contract because the residential contract gives us a general repairs section. We can put an amount of money in there. It also gives us a WDO section, which is your road destroying organism section. And then it gives us a permit section. So let's say we found that there's a bonus room that's been added, and yet there's no permit that on file for that bonus room. So we know there's some things there that we need to have fixed on the house. And it's a contract maybe like a FHA or a VA contract. So we know we're going to need to have some things fixed on it. If that's the case, that residential contract is probably pretty good to use. There are some companies, I know Watson and I think Remax nowadays will not accept the as-is contract if you're writing on an FHA or VA loan. So just be aware of that. If you're dealing with a listing agent that's Watson or Remax, and you have a VA or FHA loan and you send them an as-is contract with a VA or FHA addendum, they will send it back to you and say that it's not going to work. Because technically it can't be as is with an FHA or VA addendum. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into VA and FHA addendums. So on the as is basically says, I'm not going to ask for any repairs, nothing. And this is very important when you're talking to your buyers. They cannot technically, according to the contract, ask for one single thing, nothing, as is. It is what it is, as you see it. Now, is there a technicality within that paragraph? Yes, there is, because it does say that the seller warrants that there is no material fact that they know of that is going to affect the value of the property. So if the seller can't see a leak inside the roof in the attic, they don't know about it. So if we come to that conclusion during inspections and the buyer says, well, I wouldn't have bought it if it had had a leak in the roof, and the seller didn't know there was a leak in the roof, then we can all go back to negotiating that now we need a new roof. If the HVAC seems to be working fine, but then they find out that there's really some problems with it, the seller didn't know about it, there's all sorts of things. There's an infestation of beetles somewhere underneath the crawl space. There's 1,000 different things that people don't necessarily know about, but in general they can find during inspections. So the as-is can still be used if you walk around the house and generally the house looks like it's in pretty good shape, but you want to cover your bases with a major mechanical issue or a major item that you might want to go back to the drawing board and negotiate an out for your client. So I typically use the as is. It is probably the most used contract for me, because it does give my client an ability to just walk away because the sky is blue. And it does give the seller a sense of comfortable, I don't have to do anything. And so I'm going to negotiate the best price with the seller for my buyer. But at the end of the day, if there's something major, we're going to negotiate back with that during inspections. So that's why we're going to go over the as is, because it's probably the most used by realtors. But at the same time, there is a particular time and place for the regular residential. And there's just a little bit of section, and it has to do with inspection repairs that is different from those two contracts. Does anybody have any questions with regards to either of those two choices while we're here at that juncture?
So just when you're when you're taking a listing
Mm-hmm.
and you're presented with that contract to tell your sellers that they could have repairs
Yes.
during.
So more so in the listing agreement period or listing time. What I tell my sellers when I'm talking about listings is, thank you, ma'am. When I talk about listings and repairs, if you go into a listing and you know there's a lot of repairs, and let's say the house is under 300,000, because that's that sweet spot for FHA and VA buyers, I'm going to probably have a discussion about repairs, because typically people who are going to bring you FHA and VA loans are going to have repairs, because the appraisers, the bank appraisers, are going to look for repairs, not just the inspectors. And the VA and the FHA addendums actually have that on there. They have a space on there that says that the seller would pay up to X dollar in appraisals. And realistically, if the appraisal says X, Y, and Z has to be done, you're stuck doing it because you can't get past the appraisal. And the FHA addendum and the VA addendum says the bank has to approve the appraisal in order to go forward. And the appraisals with FHA and VA stick to the house for 6 months. So if you have an appraisal done with a VA loan or an FHA loan and it doesn't appraise, or there's items marked off on there, you can't have another VA or another FHA buyer come buy that house for 6 months, because that appraisal stays with the house, not the buyer, the appraisal.
But for a conventional loan, if somebody else comes in with a conventional loan, we can just toss that first one aside, correct?
Correct. It has nothing to do with conventional. It's basically assigned with HUD.
Perfect. Thank you.
So that's something you can discuss with them at listing, that the repairs maybe need to be done on FHA or VA loans. And with that number being lower, being in a price point where they're typically going to see those types of loans, they may want to consider doing the repairs up front. Wood rot's probably the number one on those. And that's very inexpensive. So that's probably where I would say you're most going to see the repairs needing to be done, because the appraiser's going to walk around and see wood rot. And they're going to see anything to do with roofs. So they're going to note roof leaks. They're going to note wood rot. And they also, if there's anything like electrical outlets, like falling apart, if they're falling off the thing, anything hanging, kind of things like that. Those are things they're going to see. Yes, ma'am.
You said that the FHA and the VA appraisal stays with the house for 6 months. Say somebody doesn't get it, and the third buyer comes in conventional. Can they use that appraisal? Is that appraisal
No.
still?
They won't be able to use an FHA or VA appraisal. They would have to do their own. Okay. All right. Everybody got their contract in front of them now. So we're going to start with the as is. And we talked about the parties. That's going to be your seller, which is going to be, again, from your deed, and then your buyer. With your buyers' names, you're going to ask your buyers to give you their full legal names as they appear on their driver's license. Because when they go to closing, the title agent is going to ask for their driver's license. Now, one thing I'll note here is if you have a recently married couple and the young lady or whatever, a young man too, has not changed their name on their driver's license, but they have with Social Security, they need to make sure they change their driver's license before they title their house. And they will need to write the contract according to how their name appears with Social Security, because this is going to be an issue. I just had this question posed to me the other day when I wrote a contract. So make sure that if they have changed their name legally, their driver's license matches their legal name, and they do that before they go to closing. Property description, street address, city, zip. Make sure you're not screwing that up in any way, because I've had that, I've done it, so I'm guilty. I've accidentally written like northeast instead of northwest, and then everybody's been screwed up for the whole time, and then we had to redo it. So just make sure if you're doing it fast, or you're doing it late at night, or maybe you're at the beach and you've had a glass of wine, that you double check it, or you have your transaction coordinator double check it. So just always double check your street address, city, zip. Located in county, property tax ID, that's your parcel number. Real property legal description. Now, some places are going to have a nice, neat subdivision there. It's going to fit. If you have a long one, so you have rural property, you can do see attached, and you can do an addendum or an appendix there to do that full legal description. Now, let's talk about multiple properties with one buyer and one seller. Let's say you have a buyer that's going to buy multiple lots from the same seller. You can do this all on one contract. If you have somebody who's buying from multiple sellers, same buyer, you cannot do that on the same contract. So if two or three people own 2 or 3 lots next door to each other, and the buyer is going to buy all 3 lots, that is 3 different contracts. Okay. Same seller, same buyer can be on the contract. Different buyers and sellers have to be different contracts, but they can put multiple properties or multiple lots together.
Question. I've been copying and pasting the legal description off of the property appraiser website.
Be careful with that.
It says not to be used in legal documents.
Be careful.
And I was confused about that.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was about copying and pasting from the property appraiser site. I would love to tell you the property appraiser is perfect and they know everything and they get it all right. They do not always have it right. So again, the deed is the best place to get your legal description. Now, when you go to the deed, you can check the legal description there. And then if it's the same, go copy and paste it. But again, you want to check that deed, because the deed is that space that's been prepared by the attorney. That's the one that's legally correct. Also check if there's any easements there too when you check those, because for example, if there is an easement that goes with the property, then you also know that that's part of that legal description. So section D of number 1 is personal property, and it notes unless excluded in paragraph 1E. So in D, you're including things. In E, you're excluding. So make sure you're properly putting things in those two. And I'll give you examples. I've had a lot of people want to include, for example, a shed that they're going to leave, or let's say a kid's playground set that they're going to leave, or a wine cooler that they might be leaving, or, you know, some kind of summer kitchen things. So those might be being left that are not listed in this section up here in D. They might also be leaving their washer and dryer. Then in E, I've had people not leave their refrigerator because they just bought it and they still owe $3,000 on it. I've had people not want to leave a Tiffany fan that was given to them by the grandmother, or they're not going to leave the kids' playground set, or they're not going to leave the Ring doorbell. So if you see some things when you're walking around the house during the listing, especially, that your buyers want, or your sellers, do not want to leave, these are the spots you want to make sure you write in the contract, because if it's not in the contract, guess what? It stays or goes. Only the things that are listed in that written section stay with the house. And you can have some very upset buyers or sellers if they told you they wanted to keep something and you did not write it in there or exclude it when you got the copy of the contract. I have definitely purchased some washers and dryers and a refrigerator in my 20 years. So don't do what I did early in my career. Purchase price, number 2. This is going to be whatever your number is that you're going to obviously negotiate with your buyers. And at the beginning, this may be the offer price, right? The first thing you're going to do is have the offer price there. Now, if you're going to ask for some closing costs for your buyers, that number may be included in there. And you're going to go in a different section, we'll talk about that in a minute, and put where the seller's going to give them those numbers. So if the house is listed at 200,000 and your buyer needs 5,000 in closing costs, you maybe want to write it for 205 because the seller may want to net 200,000. The next section is the deposit. Now, you can do a company's offer or to be made within, and the 3 days is effective date. So I typically do within 3 days, because if the offer isn't accepted, then the buyer doesn't have to worry about doing this. Also, nowadays, most title companies want these wired. It is way, way better and legally more responsible for you all not to accept checks. I know that Ray at one point did not want any of us accepting checks from anybody. So do not typically want you guys taking checks from buyers. So what you will do is say accompanies, and then you're going to contact the title company. The title company is going to send an email to the buyer there with wiring instructions, and they're going to wire that escrow. So that's why that 3 days is there from acceptance date. Now, what I also do when I contact the seller's agent, when I'm going to write a contract, I ask them, obviously, did anybody die? Did anybody get divorced? Did anybody get married? Then I also say, who do you guys want to close with? Because I don't want to deal with holding money with we don't have a title company right now. So we don't want to deal with holding money. And it's a whole lot easier just to send that money to where we're going to close. Because then we don't have to worry about changing money back and forth. So if you know where they're going to close, you can go ahead and put that on the contract as you write it. A lot of the agents nowadays are going to put that in their private remarks, but not everybody's gotten smart yet. So you can call and ask.
If you're writing an offer, using this to write an offer, I've run across it like almost every time so far. I'm not speaking to the person who's going to give me the title information.
Right.
Can I put the offer in without that?
What do you mean? You don't have the title agent's information, you mean?
Right.
So this is why I said call the listing agent.
That's what I'm
prior
saying.
to.
I've spoken to the desk person, and she said, "We'll just send the offer."
Meaning you're not speaking to the listing agent?
Right. He's very busy. He's out on site all the time. I've had it happen to me twice, and I just couldn't get information about the escrow. She said, "Just send in your offer."
Okay. So you can put TBD.
Okay. That's
Okay, right there. That will not suffice for a executed offer, but you can certainly do that for the offer portion. When you actually get it negotiated, then it has to be changed to the actual final. But yeah, I mean, right now, obviously we're in this really wild section of time where there's, multiple offers and everybody's having to send them in 24 hours. So yes, TBD is fine for an offer. Get it in, get it as quick as you can. For the final, that executed version, you cannot use TBD there. That is not a legal offer. I mean, a legally executed contract. it does have to have a title company of some sort written in there to be an executed contract. Yes, ma'am.
Which of these three were you looking for? It's me, sale. So I pulled sale, disclosure, and listing. Those are the only ones you can find at the moment.
It's this one.
So that's what I saw. Thank you.
You're fine.
What number was that?
That was,
It's the, yeah,
2A.
yeah. So escrow agent information section. So the name, address, phone
33.
number. And you can just put it in the name section of TBD. Yeah, to be determined. And you can put to be determined by seller, because you're more than likely. Now, this was actually discussed at the agent partner meeting, if you guys were there, that some of the tactics nowadays for winning offers is that the buyers can actually offer to pay for the title insurance and therefore pick the escrow agent. So if you want to, you can, that can be something that you can do. So ultimately, if you want to pick the title agent and then in your terms, choose the title agent and pay for it. So if the buyer is willing to do that in order to help win the offer, that's certainly something you can do as well. So that's another tactic for helping win offers. And if that's something your buyer wants to do, then do it. I mean, well, it depends on the title agent, but it varies. Because so you've got your title insurance, that's going to be based on the price, right? And then you've got the, whatever amount they actually charge for their, some of them charge, $400, some of them charge $1,000. So,
But if that title company is handling closing, they will hold the money without a fee.
well, yeah, there's no additional fee for them to hold the escrow.
Okay.
All right, so then financing expresses a dollar amount or percentage. So what I always do here is do percentage, because then if I'm changing all these other numbers, because we're changing the price from the offer and we're changing all the others, I don't have to change. This one less thing I have to change. Because I know they're going to stay with whatever percentage of loan they're doing. So if they're doing conventional loan at 20% down, that's going to stay 80%. If they're going to do an FHA loan, if they're going to do a 100% VA financing, whatever it is, that's going to stay the same. Now, the balance to close, that's going to be their amount that less the escrow and less the financing. So that's their balance, their down payment, essentially less their escrow. And some people like to do additional escrow after, let's say you want somebody's going to do a cash deal and they're going to put a large amount in their escrow, but they don't want to make it as hard, right, until after inspections. So you can do half of it or a portion of it right away, and then the rest of it after inspections. So you've got that additional deposit section. And if you're going to do 15-day inspection, you can do within 15 days after effective date, or 20, whatever it is. 10 if you're doing 10. So you do have that option there. So that's another tactic you can do to again, make your offer better if you do have a buyer that's willing to put more money into escrow, but you want to make sure their money is kind of kept safe. Somebody have any questions about that one? So let's say you have a cash deal. Okay. Typically it's for cash buyers. Their money is hard. They have no contingency after inspections. They cannot get their deposit back. So if they have, let's say they want to put $25,000 into escrow, because typically on a cash deal, you're going to have a much higher escrow deposit. If they put 5 into escrow up front, that's not too bad, right? That's during inspections. That's the easy money they get back, no problem. After inspections, that money becomes non-refundable. So the 5 is the part that they would get back if everything doesn't go well during inspections. But once the inspections are over, then they can put the additional 20. Because at that point, they then know that everything's good. They're moving forward. They have no issues with the house.
And it's going toward their purchase. They're not
It
losing
is.
it. It just looks better.
Right.
Is this for a seller incentive that you would be doing that? I'm just wondering why they would do it.
Well, this is always to win a contract. This has
Okay,
nothing
so
to do with the
it's-
seller.
No, I'm saying an incentive to the seller to sell.
Well, escrow is good faith.
Yeah.
It's showing good faith that the buyer intends to buy the house. So you're always trying to be better than the next buyer walking down the street and buying the house. So anytime you're doing something, you're doing it to be better than the next buyer.
So where is it that you add it later?
It's an additional deposit B, 2B. Yeah, line 35. And then time for acceptance, offer and counter offers, effective date. So this has become very important right now because obviously we have multiple offers and we have a lot of time sensitive issues because people are, waiting, holding, all this kind of nonsense going on. Monique's like, down
I
there.
got a question on that too.
So, all right. So the time for acceptance is an legal contract portion. So you cannot have this date not dated properly in order to be an executed contract. So everybody has to sign within this date in order for it to be legally executed. So if you put time of acceptance tomorrow, then everybody has to sign within tomorrow, or you've got to redo this date. So if you're not communicating with the listing agent and the listing agent then says, we're going to wait 6 days or till Monday before we even look at offers, then your offer is now expired. It's no good. So make sure you somehow know what's going on. Make sure you read the private remarks, try to communicate with the officer listing agent, try to be reasonable with what your expectations are on the house. If you know there are a whole bunch of offers on the property or they're going to be, I would try to communicate with the listing agent because 9 times out of 10, they're going to do a highest and best at some point at a certain time within a certain day, the next day or two.
Well, wouldn't it be fair to go ahead and write that in MLS and not drag your feet on accepting the offers that can, or you'll verbally say, okay, my client's gonna accept your offer, and then they drag the feet, your contract expires by 1 day, and then, now we have another offer,
Here's the problem. We're all in this business to do what?
sell houses and make
And
money.
what?
Make money.
Right. For our what?
Clients.
Right. So your job, if you are the seller's agent, is to what?
Bring in the best and highest bid.
Highest bid.
Right.
So
I
if
get
you
it. I just,
if you got offer number 1 within 4 hours of putting the sign
Right.
in the yard,
Right.
right? And then you got a call an hour later that says, I'm bringing you another cash offer. Give me a few hours to get it in. Feasibly, what are you really going to do?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with the cash offer for my
Right.
client. I'm gonna do what's in the best
Interest of my client.
Of course, but
Right. It sucks
it
to be the
does
buyer's
suck, too.
agent.
It does,
It sucks to be the buyer's agent because I've been both.
Especially in this market.
Right.
I've been both.
Right.
And the thing is we have to, and this is one of those things that I tell people all the time. I try to put on my listing agent hat
Mhm.
when I'm a listing agent and my buyer agent hat when I'm a buyer agent.
Right.
But at the same time, when I'm talking to my buyers and we're in a multiple offer situation, I also try to educate them
Right.
about what's happened
Yeah.
when I've been a listing agent.
Okay.
Because if it were them, if it were you guys
Mhm.
and you all were the seller, what would you do?
Right.
So understand when you make your offer, this is what they're going to be looking at.
Mhm.
So if you can help them understand that they've got to make the best offer because they're going to be up against
Multiple.
multiple, and that the other agent's job is to look out for their client.
Correct.
And I always say, especially if I know who the agent is and I know they've been doing it for a while, or I know that they're good, I'll say, listen, I know her or I know him,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna tell you right now, there's no way they're gonna pick an offer with X, Y, or Z in it.
Right.
So we're gonna have to go at this hard.
Mhm.
And I'll tell them, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do that. So that's the way you win them.
When you send in an offer,
Mhm.
are they bound by any kind of moral, ethical, or legal to respond to you at all?
No.
No,
I'm going on 2 weeks, putting
no.
in the offer for I think the 4th time yesterday. And this poor woman is dying, because the only
So-
response I get is 2 words, no update.
So what you can do is you can actually request to present the offer yourself. And they actually do have to allow you to do that, either via Zoom or in person. So if you feel that your offer is not being presented, then you can request it be presented by you
To the seller.
to the seller.
Oh, I don't know that.
It's a
And how do you,
development
is that a
corporation.
written? Or do you have to write up that request, or?
Well,
how do you
I
go
would
about
put it in writing because, I mean, obviously they have to respond to you. But it is in the ethics, it's in our realtor ethics that we have the right to present the offer. And actually Lisa just made that, because that question came up at the agent partner meeting. And that, people feel like offers aren't being presented, especially in multiple offer situations.
Right.
So you can request that your offer be presented in person. So if you feel like your offer isn't being made, you can ask that and here's the thing, the seller can say that they don't want to have you, but they have to put that in writing.
What do you do when there are listings in the MLS and listing agents will not respond at all? So how do you?
If the listing agents aren't responding,
Right.
then that's a broker. Go talk to their broker.
Okay.
Because-
What if they are the brokers?
You must be working with the same person here.
Because I ran
Wait.
into it a couple times.
I've
lately, and
been
it's so
dealing with it for the
frustrating.
last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, and that is unfortunate because
Yeah.
there are some small brokerages
Mhm.
where basically the listing agents are the brokers,
Correct.
and there's really not a whole lot that obviously that brokerage is going to do because the broker is the bad guy.
Right.
But if that's the case, then that may be a GACAR. That may be go back to GACAR,
That's what I was wondering.
because that you're going back to,
Even if
hey,
they're out of the
but
area.
I would at least make the request in writing
Okay.
to present the offer yourself.
Mhm.
If you get no response to that,
Mhm.
then that goes back to ethics. And then we're talking about ethics violations of, hey, we've asked to present our offer in person
Mhm.
and we've not been allowed to do that. Then we're talking about bringing somebody in front of the board, because that's the only way we're going to make anybody change.
Yeah, if they get enough of those, then they get that.
Right.
Even if it's
Well,
an
they can get a
out-of-town
fine.
company.
If they're a member of the board, they can get kicked out of the board, and then they can't list their listings here.
Yeah.
Now, if they're not listed so here's the thing, if they're not listed in our board and you're talking about just seeing it on Zillow,
No, it's Tropical Homes, and I know it's based in West Palm.
but that may not be in Paragon. Like,
It's not.
so you have no recourse there. You have no recourse with that.
Yeah, no, they're not.
Yeah. So unfortunately, if they're not a member of our board, we can't do anything about them.
Mhm.
But the house was listed.
What's
It
the
was
address?
it?
Is it 931? What's the address?
Yeah, how do you know that?
Because this is the same one. Like, it has to be the same one that we working
Yeah.
on.
So is it in Paragon
It
then?
is.
Okay, so then that means they did
Go through.
go through the board to list it. So either they have a reciprocal of some kind, or they're either in a board with a reciprocal or they're with GACAR. So they do, if they have it listed in the MLS, then they have some sort of connection and they can be held accountable.
All I can speak to is the receptionist at the desk. I put everything in writing, texts, emails.
So that definitely needs to be relayed to GACAR, because what'll happen is eventually that will be, they'll revoke. GACAR will, I will say that our board is very receptive to protecting us in the long run. So if somebody is not, not responding and not allowing our agents to make, offers, or just not even responding, and there's enough of it being said, then at some point they'll say, well, you're not going to be allowed back.
So they're not responding to you either.
No.
Yeah.
You haven't spoken to Ms. Squire?
All right,
Both agents.
let's keep going so we can stay on time. All right, so closing date, again, picking your closing date, making sure that you're communicating is important if you can. Again, we got issues with closing date, probably if we also have, we have issues with time for acceptance and communication. But if you can be aware of what the seller wants, then you can put the right information in there. If not, just make sure that you're communicating with your buyer's lender, because the lender will give you, I can close in 30 days, I can close in 45, things like that. So that's really important to make sure that on that date you have that properly there, so you're not having to do extensions. If they're running behind and they tell you they can't close till 60 days, then you want to make sure that you're doing that.
Is there a standard you put in there? If there's
No, it's going to be according to whatever type of loan you're doing. And if it's cash, obviously you've got to talk to the title company and find out what, how quick. Title companies often are running behind. Typically they could do a cash deal in 10 to 15 days. But if title's running behind, if they're all busy and it's summertime, they might not be able to do it for more than that.
When you're filling this out as an offer, is that essentially important or can be changed later?
Well, the problem is if you put too short of a time and then there's multiple offers and now there's a higher offer as a backup, the seller could say they don't want to give you an extension.
Oh.
So you could really honestly kill your deal with your buyer in a situation where there's backup offers. If your buyer was the first offer in a multiple offer situation and it was accepted, and now you're 6 weeks down the road and now you're asking for an extension, and now there's 3 backup offers and backup offer number 2 is $10,000 more. Why would I give you an extension if I was the seller?
And wouldn't they lose their earnest deposit too, possibly, if it's?
Well, yeah, it would just depend if you watched your dates or not.
Yeah.
If you asked for the extension before the loan contingency was up, you could keep your deposit. But if you asked for it on the closing date, then no, you're not.
Okay. Cool.
Say that again, so that makes sense.
If you asked for the extension
Okay.
during your loan contingency, which we'll talk about in another paragraph, you could get your deposit back, because you would either cancel or you would ask for an extension.
Okay.
But if you did not, if you asked for it on the closing date or after the extension or after the loan contingency was expired, you would lose your deposit, your buyer's deposit. So section 5, line 53, which is the next page, it says if paragraph 8B is checked and closing funds from buyer's lender are not available on the closing date, the closing date shall be extended for such a period to satisfy the CFPB requirements. Such period shall not exceed 10 days. Understand that this is an automatic extension if for some reason the closing disclosure did not go out and it has to be extended. So this is an automatic. If for some reason they did not get the closing disclosure out, and it's the lender's fault. If the lender makes a boo-boo and doesn't get the CD out according to the Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure requirements on the closing date, and they can extend for up to 10 days. So the seller can't do anything about it if the lender makes a boo-boo. Also, if the event constituting force majeure causes services essential for closing to be unavailable, so this is going to be like, you know, a hurricane, a tornado, a fire, hazard insurance isn't available because of a hurricane, then closing is going to be extended automatically, and the seller can't do anything about it. So those are the only two things that are going to automatically extend it that the seller cannot say no to. Occupancy and possession. For some reason, people have a problem with this, and I don't understand why, but they really do. So you honestly need to have this conversation with people, especially sellers. They got to get out of their house. Like the day they sign the papers, that morning or that afternoon when they sign and their people are paying you for your house, you don't own it anymore. You got to give them the keys, and all your crap has to be out of the house. And for some reason, people have a problem with this. I've actually had someone leave their dog and all their stuff there. So make sure you do walkthroughs, please. Very important to do a
Or
walkthrough.
you'll be like me and the listing agent there the morning of closing, cleaning out.
Correct.
Refrigerator, sweeping, mopping,
Right,
vacuuming.
right,
Taking
Or
trash out.
yeah, or the seller will be paying $1,000 into escrow for a cleaning company and somebody to come trash out all the stuff on the front yard because they didn't get it done the day before.
What if they leave something that was in the original excluded? And they go back and
No,
that's-
no. If it's 2 p.m. on closing day and they signed the documents and the money is there, it's
what
now the
this-
buyer's.
that
Now,
washing
unless the
machine
buyer,
says.
unless the buyer agrees to let them come back and get it, but technically, as of that date and time, it is the buyer's house. Occupancy and possession.
So if you get into that situation, what's the process for collecting those funds? If you have to come up with it to,
Well, you
you're the
don't.
ones-
You don't. You are not responsible for jack poop. So don't let anybody put you in that position. But here's what I've done. My seller just did this to me. She was an older lady and she just did not get her stuff out. So we wrote into escrow. Thankfully, she had enough money. She was getting money. So I was lucky in that respect. But we wrote into escrow $1,000. So escrow
When did you do
$1,000.
that?
Well, we did it that morning because the buyers did their walkthrough prior to closing. And so when they went to go do their walkthrough, she still had stuff in the house. And she declined my offer to have someone come clean it and help her move. And so I told the agent, I said, please go do the walkthrough ahead of time because she will not let me help her. So he did. And of course, it was not cleaned and things were not out as I projected it to be. And so I called her up and I said, look, you're going to have to sign this escrow agreement because you did not do what I told you to do. And so that's how we handled it. So if you know that
What if
you
you
know,
don't sign it?
well, then the buyer doesn't have to close. So they won't sell their house. It's real simple. Sign it or you don't get your money.
Now, I have another question. How clean does it have to be in this market?
It has to be cleaned according to the buyer's acceptance.
Oh, I thought it was just broom swept clean.
It's what it says in the contract, but ultimately a buyer is going to sign a contract to buy your house and they're also going to sign a closing document. So if the buyer doesn't accept it, they don't have to buy it. So when they get there that day to walk through it, if they don't accept the cleanliness, then they don't have to buy it.
I sent in an offer, it was not accepted. There's been no money exchanged, the escrow hasn't gone through or anything, because the buyer decided all of a sudden, for some reason she doesn't want it. Called the listing agent immediately and told her, forget it. So she just sent me last night that the seller is the type of person that will hold her to the escrow amount. Even though no nothing's exchanged.
As
Do
is
it.
or residential?
It was a cash residential. Can he do that?
I mean, anybody can hold anybody contractually to any I mean, the contract is a contract. So sure, if she doesn't do what she's supposed to contractually, any buyer or any seller can hold anybody contractually. It just depends on what she did or didn't do. So what is the listing agent saying she didn't do?
She just backed out of the contract. She,
When did she back out?
oh, like 2 days ago.
Okay, so during the inspection period?
It hasn't been inspected yet.
So then the listing agent
Actually,
doesn't obviously.
the inspection was scheduled for today and I
Okay.
pulled it off on Friday.
Okay, so the other agent is obviously uneducated in how escrow works because the inspection period was how many days? Okay, so did you send a release and cancellation?
I sent one last night.
Okay,
I'm just-
so as long as the release and cancellation was sent during the 7-day period, then there is nothing they can do.
But they will try.
They will
Just
try.
that, yeah.
They will try, but there is absolutely nothing they can do.
Yeah.
So they could certainly threaten to take them to a FREC. They have 15 days. If they try to do that, that's fine, but they wouldn't stand up.
I had one that did that and said, well, they're not gonna give it back. I'm like, well, my client's
She hasn't
not,
paid it yet.
yeah, I'm like, well, my client's not gonna give up half of her escrow.
And who's the escrow agent?
It's out in Old Town, Dixie Title.
Okay, so I would call the escrow agent in Dixie and just say, look, I'm aware that this seller is going to say that they want the escrow, but you and I both know that in a FREC hearing that my client would win. I would appreciate you calling the seller and educating the seller because it looks like the listing agent doesn't understand that. And let the title agent try to resolve it because
Was the contract a standard or was it an as is?
It was an as is.
It was an as, okay, because in a standard, doesn't it have to be from something that they see on an inspection report from a professional? I
yeah,
can see
but
that, but
it was
it's as is, yeah, you can walk away from anything.
and if you're using a residential, you can put an as-is addendum on it, which I would always advise doing. If you're using a residential contract, there is an as-is addendum. One of the addendums that I would highly recommend always putting on is an as-is rider. It basically makes the regular residential contract, it gives the same clause to the residential contract that the as-is does.
To be able to walk away.
Correct.
Otherwise, the only reason that you could walk away from the residential contract is if
Is
there was
something from inspection.
What's that called? What's that addendum
It's-
called?
Right to cancel. It's right to cancel addendum.
And is it the same amount of time?
Yes, your inspection period doesn't change. It's just an addendum that takes the language from the regular as-is or from the as-is contract and basically adds it on to the regular contract.
What extent do the repairs have to be for you to be able to walk away? Like, do they have to be major, like they could? be
More than the
minor?
money that you've put in there.
More than the escrow deposit?
No,
Or just
so-
meaning-
Each general repair section, so
Okay.
if you put $1,000, they do more than $1,000. And or the seller has to be not willing to repair it because if the seller says they'd be willing to repair it, you're still stuck.
Or you could cancel the contract and just run the risk of losing your escrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So let's talk about property subject to leases occupancy after closing. So if you are buying property that's currently rented, you need to ask for copies of the leases and copies of the deposits upfront, because this is all going to be something you're responsible for getting dealt with prior to closing. Because guess what? The lease may affect the person moving in, and there's going to be security deposits and or possibly pre-collected rents that you have to now get from the seller to the buyer. So make sure you have all of your ducks in a row.
Do you try to discourage that?
No.
When you're doing it?
Why not? Why? I've dealt with parents buying for their kids that are buying a leased property and then the kid's going to move in a couple months later. I've had investors buy that they want a tenant in it. So they're literally looking for an already, and they're just going to keep the tenants. I've had people that want the house, but there's a tenant in it. So they'll wait out the lease. Or I've had people that want the house and they'll buy out the tenants to get the house. So no, not at all. I have no issue with it.
Even when you're new? It's so
I came from-
complicated.
I
It says,
can't-
yeah, this is-
I
It's
came from
so-
property management, so I may be the wrong person to ask that question to.
So you're just making sure all the leases and the occupancy, you're not rewriting anything.
Well, you're going to have to.
You have to rewrite the leases.
The leases will have to be rewritten because the lease is with the current owner.
Oh,
So the leases will have to be rewritten to the new owners.
But we don't rewrite.
N-
those. We
no.
have to get
Well, there are leases in there. We
In
can,
Florida.
okay, we can.
but we don't want.
It depends. I mean, again, it's all according to what you want to do. There are leases in there. If you feel comfortable with it, you can. If you don't, then don't. So but they will have to be rewritten because the current lease is with the current landlord, which is the current owner. So if there is a lease, it has to be rewritten with your new buyer.
Does it have to have the same terms as the old lease?
Yes,
Okay, this is
unless
not the
it's
same as-
renegotiated. You would have to renegotiate with the current tenants in order to change anything.
And would that need to be signed prior to closing? Yes.
Okay, I have another question. This is not renting back. This is different. This is.
No,
leasing.
this is not post-occupancy, pre-occupancy. This is a tenant that has nothing to do with the sale. Yeah, this is like third-party tenants that are just living in there and renting from the seller. Assignability. 7, which is line 77. May assign and be released, may assign but not be released, and may not assign. The typical is going to be may not assign this contract, because that means the two parties, seller and buyer, are going to stay the same. They're not going to change. If you assign and be released, that means the seller or the buyer, which typically you don't want to release the seller, can be released from all liability. The second one, may assign but not be released from liability, would basically mean that there may be a third party. For example, let's say mom and dad are signing this contract and they're going to add a son or daughter, or a husband and wife, or one of the other is going to sign and they're doing a POA or something. There's a couple of different scenarios of this, or they're going to change it to an LLC. They're not going to be released from liability, but you know they're going to need to change the document. You can check that box. So they could assign the contract to another party. Most sellers are not going to be happy with that box being checked. Because if you're giving a pre-approval for buyer A or a proof of funds for buyer A, and you assign to somebody else, what you could just assign to somebody who does not have the same pre-approval or does not have the same proof of funds. Section 8, financing, cash. No financing contingency. Everybody understand that? Okay. If a buyer obtains a loan for a part of the purchase price of the property, buyer acknowledges that any terms and conditions imposed by the buyer's lender or CFPB requirement shall not affect or extend the buyer's obligation to close. So this can be used as a negotiating tactic. So let's say you have a buyer that has the cash to buy it, but they intend to get a loan anyways, but they want to win the deal. You can check that box. What does that mean for them if they decide to get a loan?
They have a finance contingency.
They do not.
Oh, they do. Oh,
If they check that box,
Which box is that again?
the cash box,
Oh.
if they use their cash box to win the deal in a multiple offer situation and they intend to get a loan, they can do it,
mhm.
but they do not have a loan contingency.
So,
Okay, I had this go down in a situation where there were 7 offers. We used the cash, we provided the proof of funds, but we intended to get a loan. The seller did not want to let the appraiser in the house. And I said, right here, got it in the document. We can get a loan if we want to, just doesn't affect the contingency. Seller has to let us in for an appraisal. Had to let us in.
Why wouldn't he let you in if it was a cash deal?
Well, they wanted to say that they didn't have the right to have an appraisal because we were cash. And I said, we can have whatever we want.
I was gonna say,
Contractually, we can do what we want.
with a cash deal, you don't need an appraisal, doesn't mean you can't have one.
Correct.
Okay.
But the
But-
seller
Yeah, I
was
confused a
pissed.
second.
The seller was pissed because we said we were cash and then we decided we were getting a
why?
loan.
Because they feel like they had overpriced the house. Then?
Well, no, they just felt like they picked us because we were cash.
That is
And I
kind of-
said, well, we do have the cash,
Mhm.
but we want to get a loan.
Because interest rates are so low, is that why?
Well, no, my buyers never intended to use their cash. They had it,
That's a strong.
but
fact
they
right
never
there.
intended to use
Under
it.
what circumstances would they have to use it? Could the buyer?
If their loan didn't, if the loan didn't go through,
But it couldn't be.
if it didn't appraise, if the house didn't
Oh, okay,
appraise,
so they
the
still
loan
had
would,
an out. They had an out because
No,
of
they
the
did
loan.
not.
Oh,
they did not have an out.
So what was the benefit of the appraisal?
They had to have it for the bank. You can't get a loan without an
Yeah,
appraisal.
okay, all right.
Plus it gave them insight into the house.
Every loan is gonna have to have an appraisal. Do we understand that? Everybody
Yeah.
follow?
Yeah.
Even if it's cash.
Yeah.
No.
Every loan.
Every loan has to have an
Yes,
appraisal.
Yes.
Why did that work? Like, I get the tactic, I get the move. it
Because there were
won the bid.
7
I know, that's
offers.
what I'm like, I get the fact that it won out over everyone else, but contractually, you check the box cash. So how, in the middle of the contract, can you decide that now all of a
We
sudden?
knew,
you wanna
we
do
knew from the
finance?
beginning we were getting a loan.
Right, correct, but how can that fly though?
You checked that box from the beginning?
That's like a strong tactic right there.
Yeah, can't
They had the money.
Can't the
Right.
seller say?
They had the money.
Can't the seller say?
They could have at any point, Monique,
Yeah.
bought the house for cash. So at any point,
Right.
they could have provided the
But
cash.
So my question was, how many days did you?
They had
close
no
it to
contin-
close?
Here, we
Because-
did 30 because the
Oh,
people
oh,
needed to find a
okay.
house anyways. I
Gotcha.
called.
Okay.
I said, hey, listing agent,
Okay,
how quickly can your people get out?
yeah.
Got a cash buyer. Oh, well, I knew. They had dogs, they had kids, they
Okay,
had
so needed
furniture.
time,
They
yeah.
needed time.
They needed
She goes,
time.
oh, we have to find another house.
Yeah, okay.
They need at least 30 days. Perfect.
Perfect for financing. Oh,
Call the lender. You can close in 30 days. Oh yeah, girl, I can close in 20. Perfect.
So even though this contract says buyer will pay cash for the purchase at closing.
There is no financing contingency to buyer's obligation to close. If buyer obtains a loan
Ah,
for any part of the purchase price of the property, buyer acknowledges that any terms and conditions imposed by the buyer's lender or by CFPB requirements shall not affect or extend the buyer's obligation to close or otherwise affect any terms or conditions of this contract.
So this is the only cash box. You always check this one for cash,
Yes.
but it says you can get a loan too.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
At the end of the day, you can provide any type of loan. You put on this what you think your buyer is going to do, right? This is what your proposal is for. But at the end of the day, the buyer can change their terms, because a lot of times buyers go in and they do their application after they write this, and they may change their terms anyways, because they may go into their application process and they may find that there's a better option. They may put more money down, less money down, whatever. So remember, this is the proposal. This is the offer, right? But at the end of the day, as long as the cash from whoever
And
shows
as long as
up,
the terms don't change and know the time for closing.
the closing
doesn't
date is
extend.
met
Yeah,
and the cash is there from whoever,
okay.
bank
Yeah,
or seller, or buyer,
okay.
that's all that matters.
Okay.
So just remember that if a seller gives you a hard time, I can get financing. I can have an appraisal. Don't give me a hard time. So yes, you can use that tactic if you need to.
But you better have the cash.
But you have to have proof of funds. We had proof. So here's the thing: the buyer has to have the funds, because at the end of the day, if the appraisal doesn't work out, or if closing date comes, they have to be able to close with their
Right.
cash.
Okay,
They can't do it if they don't have it.
right.
So you have to actually be a cash buyer in order to say you're a cash buyer.
And you verified with your
Oh, I had their proof of
buyers.
funds.
Yeah.
Oh,
proof of
yeah.
funds.
We had their proof of funds up front to show they were cash buyers. And then they just decided, hey, we would rather get a loan than use our cash. Not a problem. We can do that. So, all right, now second box, contract is contingent upon buyer obtaining approval of whatever type of loan. Again, if they can get a conventional loan, that's going to look better than an FHA VA loan. If they switch to one of those, they will have to put that addendum on there. So that's the one that you can't go back and forth with. Okay? Because the FHA VA has an addendum that has to go on the contract. So you can't switch back and forth. So this one is the one that you can't switch from. If you say you're going conventional and then you decide that you've got to go FHA VA, there's an addendum that goes along with it and you can't switch back. So, and I hate that these boxes are on the as-is contract, but then it doesn't match up with this contract. But we do it all the time. So here's the deal. FHA VA can be as is on a house that's clean as a whistle. Okay? Because the addendums that match up with FHA and VA say that the seller agrees to pay up to X dollars in appraisal repairs. So they could say they're selling the house as is, but then agree to pay appraisal repairs. If the house is really clean, if it's pretty new and there's really nothing wrong with it, you could put in there $0, or you could put in there $100 or $500 and still use an as-is contract. The seller also has to pay for the WDO according to that addendum.
Where is this?
It's the FHA VA addendum. You're not going to read that here. It's an addendum.
Oh.
I'm explaining to you why this doesn't match up here. Okay. So that's why a lot of agencies, a lot of brokerages do not like the FHA VA addendum or contracts with as is. Okay. Loan contingency section. When you have obtaining loan approval within X days, if you write a 30-day contract, how many days should you write a loan approval for?
I have a friend of mine who just told me that she writes it all the way up to the day of closing, because she has gotten swift with it, and I'm just like, what are you talking about? She was like, run it. If it's 30 days or 45, that's what you write on there. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting.
So I typically write it for a few days at the least. 3, 4, 5. 5 is my day,
This
because
is working on the buyer or the listing?
the buyer.
The buyer.
Because most listing agents don't like to the day of closing. Okay. They will, unless they just don't pay attention,
Mhm.
they will not let a 30-day closing and a 30-day loan approval fly. And when you are trying to win a multiple offer situation, writing a 30-day loan approval on a 30-day closing
Mhm.
is not going to win you the deal.
This line 91 you're talking about?
87.
87.
87. Um, 90, line 90 is the term. So that's 30 years or 15 years or 10 years. That's the term of the loan.
So if you were accepting contracts on something, and you seen it come through, you're looking.
If
for
I'm the listing agent, I would not let that fly.
So what would you, and it was multiple offer situation, you would be looking for the one with the least amount of.
I will allow 5 days. I will allow 5 days because it typically, here's the thing. You're going to look at this. You're going to see typically on a, let's say it's a 30-day loan or a 45-day loan period, 15 of it's going to be inspections, right? Because that's typical.
Right.
Appraisals right now are taking 2-3
Yeah,
weeks.
forever. Okay.
So there's 25 right there.
Right.
So I'm pretty much giving people 25 days on a 30-day because that's, I mean, you're not going to get your appraisal back.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, ultimately, I feel like you need those couple of days because you got to get a CD back and forth. But at the same time, that 5-day window gives me that window to get a deposit if somebody don't pay attention, if I'm the seller's agent.
So, but you can only get that if if they're not approved though, then you can't keep their deposit.
Yeah, if they get a true denial letter.
Correct.
And I'm going to tell you, there are very few companies writing denial letters right now.
Okay.
Very few.
So if we get to this far, gone past, for some reason, they said, then how could you keep it then?
Yeah, how can we keep it
Yeah.
if they don't close?
But they want to close because we're at this point though.
Right? But if it's, let's say they can't close because they passed their date and now I have a backup offer that's $10,000 more. So now I keep your deposit and I go to buyer number 2 who's paying me $10,000 more. Just remember,
I am,
seller's
that's what I'm
agent
trying to
hat,
do. Right.
and my job is to get the most money for my client.
But
Now, if I don't have a backup offer,
right,
then I'm going to work with you.
right, because you're already knee deep
Yeah.
in with the appraisal and
Yeah.
everything else. trying to get
And ultimately, if I know that y'all are pretty much done
Yeah.
and you only need a day or two more, and
Right.
I've talked to y'all's, because I have a transaction coordinator. Jenny's going to be on it. I've already talked to y'all's lender.
Mhm.
She's going to talk to you.
Mhm.
She's going to know that y'all are so close.
Right.
So if we're 1 or 2 days away from closing,
Mhm.
we're just going to work with y'all because I ain't trying to go through a whole nother 30
Right, right,
days.
right.
But if there's really a problem
Mhm.
and it's
Shaky.
shaky, we're taking your escrow and we're moving on to buyer number
Just
2.
had that happen. Like we were 3 days out, and the girl, like she decided to finally tell me that something in her bank account was off, and she
Mhm.
didn't want to show her bank account statements to ship to get their funding, and we killed the deal after 2 months. And I'm
Yep.
like, "Are you serious?"
Yeah.
And they actually gave her escrow back, but I was surprised though because
Yeah.
I thought that they were going to keep her $1,500.
Yeah.
Because we were well beyond.
Yeah,
With
well
an
beyond the
extension,
days.
They could have.
They
Yeah, they
could
could
have.
have.
They could have.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't know, but they could have.
So, I mean, again, I know this is coming off as being like, oh gosh, she's horrible. She's cutthroat, but I really am not. I honestly, I hate writing. I hate the way we've had to go to at this point.
Right.
But at the end of the day, think about where your sellers are
After being on the market.
after being on the,
Yeah.
and you
Right.
put your, and a lot of times they've paid
Off the
another,
market.
they're going to have to pay another month of mortgage.
Right.
Some of them are in a contract
Mhm.
to purchase a house.
Yeah.
What are they going to do now?
Right.
So your job is to be the best for them,
Right.
not to look out for the other buyer.
Right.
So you've got to put yourself in that seller's hat in that situation, not the other buyer. And it ultimately comes down to what you know about that other deal.
Mhm.
If the other deal's on good terms and you're only a day or two away from it or a week or so, then work it out.
Mhm.
But if there's something really going on and they're not being forthcoming and they didn't tell you all about it and it seems weird, nobody will communicate, and you can't get anybody to talk to you, cut your losses, get out of it and go to buyer number 2.
So at what day, so after we don't have, after day 25, say we said 25, there's no loan approval at day 25, and like you just said, all those
It
factors
seems
are in place,
shady
and
and
we're gonna
nobody-
go ahead and pull and go with the next one. Oh, okay. So,
What is the process to do
yeah,
that?
that's what I was.
Well, so at day 25, you can't do it as a listing agent. I can't do anything at day 25.
But day 26.
Day 26, I'm going to be looking for you to give me a loan approval,
Gotcha.
right?
Okay.
I still can't do anything without a cancellation until the day the contract expires. I'm going to be asking for a release and cancellation from you guys,
Gotcha.
but I can't do anything until the closing date. After the closing date, then I could put the house back on the market.
Expired. Okay.
And I've been,
Unless they do send you the release.
unless they sign a release and cancellation. And most buyers are not going to want to sign that either because they don't want to give up their escrow.
Plus all the money on inspection.
Mhm. They're going to be begging and pleading to keep it and blah, 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 blah.
What do you advise your sellers when they do that?
What, when they beg for it? Split it halfway. If they start crying about it and they don't want to sign it and they're sad about it, I say let's just split it with them halfway. Because if you can't get it decided upon within 15 days, you're screwed and you're going to freck. All right, so we're like 8 minutes from being at our hour and a half, which I know everybody. So we're not even gonna get to addendums. Sorry. All right, we're gonna try to go through this quickly, so at least I can get through the contract with y'all. All right, so the rest of it is just terms. Fixed and adjustable rate. You always want to make sure you're doing fixed. 30 years is typically, unless your person. So this is according to what type of loan they're getting. This is their contingency. So keep in mind, whatever they've discussed with you that they are getting from their lender, this is their contingency. So if they've told you they've gotten a 4% interest rate with a 30-year loan and it's fixed, put that in there. Because otherwise, if the rates go up skyrocketing, then it's going to be prevailing rate and they don't have a contingency to hold them in. Let's say they're really close to their numbers. And if the rates went up to 4.5, they wouldn't get this house. See what I mean? So make sure you talk to them as a lender about that. Especially right now with rates going up, it's probably important to put the rate number in there, not just prevailing. We aren't doing assumption of mortgages right now, purchase money mortgage or seller mortgage. If you are doing any sort of seller financing, that's where that would be checked. That's line 124 on the following page, page 3. Closing costs, title insurance, survey, home warranty. This is where it outlines what everybody's paying for. If there is anything that the seller or buyer are going to negotiate, they pay for each other. This is where that will go. Our KW brokerage fee goes in here into other, paid by the buyer or paid by the seller. So that other section. Also, if I'm going to say that I want the seller to pay closing costs, I'm going to put C additional terms into other. So under the seller section, section 9, under other, I'm going to put C additional terms. And then on line 158 and 162, this is where you would designate the closing agent. So if you're going to do that, where you designate the buyer pays the closing agent's fees, then this would be the box you check on 162. If the seller's going to do it and pay the owner's policy, you're going to keep that as 158, which is what we do now. That's typical.
Okay,
All right.
I just one quick question.
Mhm.
So in the additional terms for our Keller Williams brokerage fee, then what do we put? And is there something else we add?
Well, you're just going to put Keller Williams brokerage fee of 195.
Okay.
What line is that on again?
Well, that's just in the other.
On 144? I have to put it on 144.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Can you do another class for just addendums?
Yeah, well, we'll stay, I mean, if you guys want to stay, if anybody who wants to stay, I'll stay and do some addendums. I just didn't want to, I wanted to get everybody out of here by 11:30 if you had other things to do.
I have a showing to go to. I'm really
But yeah,
interested in
we'll
addendums.
probably do a different one for addendums since we went a little bit longer. All right, home warranty is 173. Buyer, seller, NA, depending on who's going to pay for it. Warranty plan name, and then the cost. Make sure that you check the cost of the plan that you choose and that it includes everything, especially if you have something with a septic, a well, a condo. Those are all different prices. And if you're doing any additional items that you're going to do, like listing, including during listing. Special assessments. If you're selling anything in Turkey Creek, there are special assessments right now. The golf course has special assessments. So just make sure that you are aware of that, because some people agreed to pay it before, some people are paying it currently. So just make sure you ask that of the seller before you check those boxes. Additional disclosures, radon gas, permits, mold, flood zone. These are all really important things that you guys need to know about. I had a lady who sold her daughter's house after her daughter died. It had 110 radon. The EPA allowable is 4. Her daughter probably died because of the radon gas. And the agent that sold her the house did not include telling her to get a radon test.
How often do you see them get? I myself just had someone do a mold inspection. It was $500.
It's very expensive.
They had a underground thing that had leaky old pipes, and it was full of, like, the mold readings were off the chart, and it absolutely canceled the deal on it. But that's the first time I've ever had someone. She could smell mold, like she was one of those hypersensitive people that when she walked in, it's mold in this house. Like I
Yeah.
know it is, but we didn't know to what extent. So she was like, "I'm paying for it." And
Yeah.
it was crazy.
So I'm allergic to mold,
Are you?
smoke, and so I can usually smell water damage
Mhm.
pretty badly. I mean, my
Yeah.
eyes will start watering. I'll have to step out of the
Yeah.
house. So I tell people I'm a good judge of whether or not it has mold in it. But so what I tell them is go through their general inspection.
Mhm.
If they find any like leak, any water damage, anything like that, that'll kind of give them a good idea. But they can do, like, I know Gator Homes does a kind of a light $150 mold. Well, they'll put these little like fan looking things out, and it'll take a like an air sample reading. And then if that comes back with anything in the air, then they can do the like real extensive where they do the samples from the walls and the ground and all that. So there's some things they can do. Radon is $150 no matter what. So radon's an easy one, fairly inexpensive. There are certain areas that are higher. You can actually look at the maps online. So there's a way to like discover which areas have higher. I can tell you all up 8th Avenue is real bad. Tioga has some spots.
This is all
Why
during
do
the
they think?
inspection.
Why do they think it is though?
So radon is a naturally occurring gas under the ground.
Mhm.
So it's just in pockets in certain places.
How do you look that up, the radon maps?
You can there's like a website that's for radon in Florida.
But you would recommend everybody have it done anyway.
I mean, to me, I always tell my clients, if you would like to do it, I suggest having it done. It's one of the inspections we suggest.
And then that's during the inspection
Mhm.
timeframe.
Permits, make sure that you have an inspector that looks at permits for them. Again, mold is just one of those things that they can choose. Flood zone and elevation certification. Typically when they are doing their inspections, I have my insurance people send them quotes, but you can choose to tell them to do it, whatever you want to do. But the insurance folks will generally, they're going to look up and see if the house needs flood, but you can also look up flood zones with Realist if you want. But checking the flood zones is important, because if they need an elevation certificate or a LOMA done prior to their closing, that's important, and that takes a while. So you're gonna need to know that pretty quickly.
And be sure
So-
you know that before you get into the contract, don't be like me, and then you get in and find out that you're in a flood zone, and your client needs to do all the long run.
Is there a key someplace to the different flood zones? Cause somebody says to me, is this an A1? And I'm like, I
Yeah,
will find
FEMA.
out.
FEMA
You
site.
can get a key to.
Yeah, FEMA has an explanation to all the different flood zones.
Okay, yeah, cause somebody was throwing all these flood zones at me and I was like, I'm gonna have to.
That's
look
good
at it.
information, thanks.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're giving your buyers a copy of the energy brochure with everyone that you take out, because it is referenced in the contract. So
At what point do you give it to them?
the moment you meet them,
First showing it?
yes, because it's in the contract. So the first time you ever meet with anybody, you should be giving a copy of the energy brochure. Should be, have a little folder put together. I have the energy brochure. I have the lead-based paint in there. I have
How
some
long do you
do's
have
and
those
don'ts.
forms? Where do we get them?
I got them offline. I print them. I mean, they're not, I don't think they have them in here anywhere, but GACAR has them. You can purchase them technically, but you can also get them online.
Okay, so
Yes, ma'am.
that was it.
Does the surveyor, do the elevation certificate or,
Yes.
okay, so we would just make sure that the surveyor knows that the elevation certificate has
And
to
a
be done?
lot of times the seller may already have an elevation certificate if it's in a flood zone.
Okay,
So
I feel like in Gainesville, we don't get that very often, but it's good to know ahead of time.
you'd be surprised.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you.
Yes, it can also
But how do you
change.
know if it's good?
So FEMA rewrites their maps every couple of years, and a lot of places that weren't in the flood zone before, all of a sudden will get put in a flood zone after a big hurricane. So there's a lot of times that it may not have been previous and now it is. So, but the elevation, you can look up the base elevation on FEMA's site by putting in the parcel number, and it'll show you what the base elevation is. So if the base elevation is higher than flood zone level, or basically sea level, then you know you can get an elevation certificate, and that would actually make your flood zone flood
What do you use for
insurance.
home insurance that you refer people to that are really good with getting?
So I use Angie Arnold at Arnold Insurance,
Okay.
Jess Odom at Farm Bureau, and Courtney McAllister at McGriff Williams.
What farm, yeah,
Mhm.
what was the first one?
Angie Arnold at Arnold Insurance. Angie's really good. She has mobile home options.
Cool.
So that's, and Angie has been doing it for a really long time and has a lot of really good options.
Okay.
Farm Bureau, it doesn't, they can't write in a couple different places, but if you have Progressive, they match with Progressive and their rates are really, really good.
Okay.
And then McGriff has a bunch of, they're like a broker, so they can see a bunch of different ones, and they offer a lot of good rates too. But McGriff doesn't do any mobile homes.
Who was with Barbara?
Jess Odom.
The, when you're showing homes, I'm doing a lot of
Let-
virtual.
Let me
Oh,
just,
okay.
if you
Okay.
guys, let's keep your questions to the end real quick. We'll
Okay.
get through this for those that have to go.
Okay.
And then we'll do some questions and answers with anybody who wants to stay after. All right, so lead-based paint, there is an addendum for that. Pre-1978, you need to make sure that you are giving them that disclosure. It is mandatory, and there is a disclosure that goes with it. Additionally, that pamphlet that goes with it as well. Homeowners Association disclosure, if it is in a homeowners association, you need to make sure you get the accurate information. Don't trust the seller. Call the HOA, get the numbers from the HOA, because the sellers sometimes will give you inaccurate numbers. Or ask them for a copy of their most recent payment. Property tax summary. Do not rely on the seller's current property taxes. It says this is to the buyer. So make sure that you are not telling anybody the taxes based on the seller's current taxes. It's going to be based on the price that they are paying, not the seller's previous taxes. Everybody understand that? Okay. If they are a foreign national, they will have to pay FERPTA. So this is important for anybody who's out of the country buying here. Seller's disclosure, they are not required to fill that out. However, our office requires them to fill it. So technically in the state, there is no seller's disclosure requirement other than they just have to tell us if there's a material fact. So you'll find that in other MLSs, they will not have a seller's disclosure. There is a line or a document we have that's basically like a waiver. So if someone does not know anything about the property, you can have them sign a waiver. And it's basically they never lived there, they don't know anything about it. So that's an option if you need that. Property maintenance, except for ordinary wear and tear, seller shall maintain the property, including lawn, shrubbery, pool, condition existing as of the effective date. Please understand that they have to mow their yard. They have to keep their pool in the condition it was when they listed it. They cannot turn it into a green cesspool with frogs and fish. That's important. Some people don't understand that either. Property inspections. They will have 15 days if you leave it blank. Otherwise, you can change the date in here. They can inspect it. They can do any kind of inspection they want. They can also say the sky is blue. I don't want to buy this house according to the as-is contract. They will have a walkthrough inspection 1 day prior to closing or on the closing date prior to the time of closing as specified by the buyer. This is very important because a lot of sellers don't understand this. It says on the day prior to the closing date or on closing date prior to closing as specified by the buyer. Buyer or buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property and to verify the seller has maintained the property as required. So realistically, this document says that they have to get all their crap out the day prior. A lot of people don't understand that because it says on the day prior to closing. So as designated by the buyer. So realistically, if the buyer wants to do the walkthrough on the day prior and the seller doesn't have their stuff out, they could push the envelope there. So if you and your buyer are scheduling the walkthrough the day before and they don't have their stuff out, then that gives you extra time to make sure it gets done. I always highly recommend trying to do that if you can. Do it the day before. Then that gives you time to figure out what you need to do if the seller has not done what they've need to do. Seller assistance and cooperation close out of building permits. If there are permits that are not closed out, make sure you know it as soon as possible so that you can work to get it done. I have one right now that's still not closing 2 months later because we have a permit with Alachua County that are dragging their feet. Escrow agent. This just goes over escrow agent and how they are to collect and deposit funds. This is really more for them, not you guys, but they have to pay everybody. So if you ever have anybody that calls up and says, hey, I didn't get my money from the title company, this is your way to push the button with the title company. They have to do it within a certain amount of time, according to the state chapter 475. Professional advice. If you give any advice to them, make sure you don't sound like any of these people: inspectors, government agencies, property condition. You just want to stay away from giving advice on anything that's not real estate related. Buyer default. If the buyer default happens, so if you fail, neglect, refuse to perform under the contract, you're going to lose your deposit, but it's in those time periods. That's why the inspection period and the loan period contingencies are important, because that's how you lose your deposit as a buyer. Seller can also go after liquidated damages. For example, they could say that they went out and bought another house and paid for a bunch of stuff with that house if you just don't show up to closing.
Whatever they repaired for you, or whatever they.
Well, not maybe, but if they went out and bought another house because you didn't show up to closing, they closed on another house and you didn't show up to closing. So it's not really something that happens a lot, but they have the right to go after liquidated damages. So just remember that just not showing up to closing because you feel like it. If you got approved for a loan and your money was there and you just didn't show up, you could be in a lot of trouble. If you just woke up that morning and you don't want to buy a house, okay, or it's a cash deal and you just decide you didn't want to buy it that day, that could be a problem. Seller default, on the other hand, is also same situation. Seller just wakes up one morning and says, I don't want to sell my house. They can also be sued for the same kind of thing. Dispute resolution. Unresolved controversies, claims, and matters between the buyer and the seller. They're going to have 10 days after the date of the conflicting demands on the deposit to attempt to resolve it. If they fail, it's going to go to mediation. They're going to attempt to settle amicably their mediation under the Florida rules with a certified court-appointed mediator. If the mediator can't fix it, then they're going to have to go to court. Attorney's fees and costs are going to be split equally in mediation. Standards, it's going to give you some restrictions for title and title examination. They're basically going to have 5 days after the date of receipt to examine the title and make sure the title is cured. Good news is with a loan, that title is going to go to the lender and the lender is going to review it to make sure the title is clear. If it's a cash deal, it's still going to have the title company looking at it and issuing a title policy. So you always want to make sure you let people know it's important to have the title reviewed, especially if you're dealing with like a for sale by owner or something like that. You always want to have a title policy involved because that makes sure the title is clear and there's no issues with title.
Isn't that what the title insurance is for?
Right, but in a cash deal, if you were dealing with like a for sale by owner and they didn't want to go through a title policy or something like that, that's why, because there could be problems with title. Survey just goes over the survey. You do not have to have a survey on a cash purchase. You usually do on loans. They're going to make sure that there's no encroachments, that you have proper ingress and egress, which means coming in and out of the property legally. Lease information, sellers shall at least 10 days prior to closing furnish the buyer estoppel letters from the tenants specifying the nature and duration of occupancy, rental rates, advanced rent, security deposits. Again, that's all those things I was telling you y'all needed. Thereafter, the tenant confirms such information, and then you're going to go ahead and provide the leases. And again, you're going to terminating the contract, receiving the refunded deposit, releasing the buyer and seller for further obligations. And then you're going to assigning the leases to the buyer who shall assume the seller's obligations. Liens, seller shall furnish the buyer an affidavit attesting the absence of liens. That's something that the title company will be looking for. They'll be looking for any liens from any contractors, making sure they're all paid off. Calendar days, time is of the essence. So there is no weekends, things like that. They all count. Okay, everybody understand? Saturday and Sunday counts in your 15 days or your 10 days or anything like that. Okay. Force majeure, we talked about that. That's like your fire, wind, anything like that. And that's where your closing date may get extended if you have any of that. Conveyance, that's going to convey that property to the deed to the buyer or from the seller to the buyer. Closing location is going to happen wherever that designated closing agent is. Sometimes when you're dealing with foreclosures, they're going to make the closing agent be somewhere in like South Florida. And so then it's going to be, they send somebody up here to close in an office like here. Closing documents, seller, and what happens with those is a lot of times you don't actually get the keys to the property till the following day. So make sure you know that if you're dealing with a foreclosure, because you may have a title company that sends somebody up here on a Friday to do a closing with your buyer, but yet no money is exchanged that day because the documents have to be FedExed back. So guess what? They don't get to move in until Monday because you can't give them the keys until that money is received.
Closing. That happened to me once.
Yep.
So my seller was freaking out.
Just be aware of that. Just be aware of that. Especially with foreclosures, that happens. Closing documents are generally, again, sometimes you've got that where it goes and has to be FedEx back and forth, especially if people are out of the area. So you may not have a closing that actual day. It may be the following day. Prorations and credits. Everything is going to be prorated to the date of closing, especially for taxes, escrow deposits, mortgages. I had one where the mortgage actually, we got delayed a couple of days. So the mortgage of the seller went into the following month. So then they owed additional interest on the loan. So the payoff was like $700 more than they expected it to be. So they got $700 less than they thought originally. And they were really upset about it later on. So just be aware of that too if you're the listing agent. Access to the property. Here we go. Access for appraisals, inspections, and walkthroughs. Seller, upon reasonable notice, provide utility service and access to the property for appraisals, inspections, and walkthroughs. Again, that is important for utilities service. They got to have the gas on. They can't just have the electric. So if there's gas to the property, make sure they have both turned on. Verify that before you go to do inspections. Call them and make sure they know when the inspections are and that it's all turned on. Risk of loss. If the property gets damaged and it exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price, or the cost of restoration shall be the obligation of the seller, and the restoration is not completed, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost will be escrowed at closing. If they're doing a 1031 exchange, which means they're going from one property and they're putting it in a 1031 to buy something else, that has to be basically disclosed to the title company. Contract is not recordable. If anything is modified, it does not change the prior agreements. If you waive one part of the contract, it does not waive anything else in the contract. If there are riders or addenda, those become part of it. Anything that is handwritten supersedes the typewritten part. There is a definition of collected and collection. Applicable law and venue would be the state of Florida, and then obviously wherever we are as far as the county that you're buying the property in. FERP to tax withholding goes over a little bit of that in the tax code. Buyer waiver of claims. To the extent permitted by law, buyer waives the claims against the seller and against any real estate licensee involved in the negotiation of the contract for any damage or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property that may exist at closing, if this contract be subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming through, under, or against the buyer. This provision does not relieve the seller's obligation to comply with paragraph 10, standard X, shall survive at closing. So understand that if something changes at closing and they didn't find it in the walkthrough, they cannot come back on us or the seller. So they can't come back and sue everybody if they go and they find something else is wrong with the house later on.
But paragraph 10 is disclosure. The
Correct.
seller has to disclose anything they know about.
So if it was found that they knew ahead of time and they tried to cover it up. So for example, if there's a bunch of stuff behind the wall, they covered it up and it can be proved that they covered it up to hide it from you, then that would be different. Then there's the section of those addendas. So you got condo riders, homeowners, seller financing, mortgage, FHA, appraisal, short sale, homeowner flood insurance, interest bearing account, defective drywall, coastal construction, insulation, lead paint, housing for older persons, rezoning, lease purchase, pre-closing, post-closing, sale, backup, kickout, seller attorney, buyer attorney, licensee, binding arbitration, Miami-Dade, and other. Those are what we were going to go over. We're probably going to do that on a different day. But if anybody has a specific one they want to ask me about right now, let's do it. I think somebody asked me about pre and post closing. Do you guys want to talk about backup and kick out clauses right now, since we have a lot of that going on real quick before I let everybody go?
Sure.
Okay. All right. I think Crystal put the kick out clause and the backup in there for y'all to look at. So kick out clause, sellers shall have the right to continue to show the property and solicit and enter into bona fide backup purchase contracts with third parties that are subject to the termination of this primary contract. Upon entering into a backup contract, seller will give buyer a copy of the backup contract with the third parties, identification and purchase price information obliterated. To continue with this primary contract, buyer must make an additional deposit to the escrow agent within 3 days from the receipt of the backup. By giving the additional deposit to the escrow agent within 3 days, buyer waives all contingencies for financing and sale of buyer's property, and the parties will close on the closing date. Additional deposit will be credited to buyer at closing. If buyer fails to timely make the additional deposit, then this primary contract shall terminate and buyers shall be refunded the deposit. Essentially, this contract is when there is a contingency upon the sale of the buyer's home but yet the seller doesn't want to take the seller's house off the market actively. So what they're going to do is they're going to continue to market the house actively with a right of refusal. So if the seller gets another contract, then it's kind of like poop or get off the pot. You either remove your contingency by this within 3 days of putting that escrow in and move forward, or you lose your contract. Does anybody have any questions about that? And how that would work?
What is that one look like?
Kick out clause. It just says kick out clause in the section X. And it is X on here as far as A, B, C, D. And then there's backup contract. So if you have multiple offers as a listing agent and you want to keep a backup offer as line number one, or you're a buyer's agent and you hope that one falls through, so you want to be number one in line for your buyer, this is a backup subject to the termination of a prior executed contract between seller and third party for the sale of the property. If the prior executed contract is terminated and seller delivers written notice of termination to the buyer before 5 p.m. on X date, put a date in there. This contingency shall be removed and the backup contract shall move into first position. The effective date of this backup shall be the date the seller delivers written notice of the termination. So this is pretty simple. It's just the backup. It reserves the first place backup offer. Everybody kind of follow on that one? Lead-based paint, we kind of talked about that. That's really important. If you have anything that's over 1978, you're going to want to use that one. So that's lead-based paint. That's in there too. I had her stick that one in there for you guys. And homeowner association. If you have a homeowners association, you're going to be filling this one out. So these two, you get filled out at the listing, really. The listing portion of your meeting. Get these two filled out by the seller. Put them in your documents. And then that they're already done and ready for the buyers. And then they just go on the contract with it.
What's the other one, the lead base?
Lead-based paint. Mm-hmm. Lead-based paint and HOA on that one. So those, I mean, those four are probably the most relevant right now, because those are ones that obviously the two are on there if it's applicable, and then the other two are kind of happening if for some reason it's a backup or a kick out. Now you do have short sale approval. I think she stuck that one in there for you guys. And then release of cancellation, that's in there if you need to release it. And then FHA, those are just relevant to if you guys are doing those types of contracts. So that's kind of a brief. We could go into a lot more. So we'll just do a separate class on it. All right, now I'm gonna open it up. Anybody got any questions from our Zoom? All right. I know we had one in here.
Yes, it was on the energy brochure.
Okay, energy brochure.
A lot of clients I'm dealing with, I'm doing virtual tours. They're out of state. Do you email it to them? Like,
PDF.
PDF, just send it to them right away with the lead disclosure.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to, you can send it with the contract if that's easier. But it is in the contract, so at the very least,
before you're at the contract stage, somebody calls me, can you show me this house?
right. If you want to do it at contract, you can do it in your.
They get it at some point.
Right. My point is it's in the contract, so at some point they need to get it.
Okay.
So as long as you have it saved somewhere, if you're doing virtual, just send it to them at some point. So I have that same. I have a PDF version of the same thing I give to people.
I'm surprised
In
it's not
person.
in the document templates. That you can include it. The lead bases.
Well, those are documents that are attached to the actual forms. The energy brochure was something that was like a brochure that they sold. Like Gakar sold the brochures, they sold the pamphlets. So the thing is, you can get them online and just print them yourself too. So I think that's why, like they actually sold those pamphlets and they sold the brochures. So I think that's why. But like I said, you can download the pamphlets and you can download the brochures as PDFs. So you don't have to do it that way. You don't have to do, like I've got, like I said, I've got them and we put them in our folders that way. Or we send them as a PDF all together in a packet. There's even a Spanish speaking version one of it. So if you have someone whose first language is Spanish, you can use the Spanish speaking version. All righty.
Thank you for doing this.
You're
This is great.
welcome. You're welcome.
I got the gag all
I
one
think
on.
I need to do this.
I think, yeah.